I'm making this video mostly because I'm a small enough channel that it won't hurt me if this gets demonetized, but large enough that people can see this and it might spark some meaningful conversation. I'm also making this video because Hitler is one of, if not the most, politicized historical figure in the Western world. So, who was Hitler? Why did he do what he did? In this video, I'll do my best to answer the internet's most burning questions about the most evil man of modern times. I've done extensive research not only into Hitler, but also the Nazi state, their invasion plans, and the Germans as a people. The number of misconceptions surrounding Hitler is astonishing considering the man lived less than 100 years ago. Despite all the documents and videos we have of him and his lackeys, there is still so much we don't know. This isn't going to be a timeline history of Hitler. You can find those somewhere else, although I might do a more detailed series on that if this video does well. This video will focus specifically on aspects of Hitler that will hopefully clear up some misconceptions. If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe and let me know if you want to see more content like this. The short answer is not really. Hitler cared about his version of Germany. He thought hard about what he needed to do to make Germany better, but he rarely considered the fate of Germany in abstract. Germany was in a really bad place after World War I, and many were concerned about the future of the nation. Hitler also worried, but he came up with solutions and wasn't willing to hear out visions that deviated far from his own. When it was clear that his visions didn't work out, by 1944 at the very latest, he still wasn't willing to consider other options. In his mind, only he could fix Germany, and if he didn't, it would fall to international Jewry. Hitler knew about the casualties, but said they were worth it because they brought Germany closer to world dominance. He knew about the sacrifices the German people were making through the war, but still lived a life of luxury on the Obersalzberg. When Martin Niemöller, a World War I veteran and conservative who supported many of the Nazis' policies, but spoke out against suppression of the church, won his freedom in a trial Hitler staged, Hitler didn't accept the outcome of this trial or hear out Niemöller. He just had him kidnapped and sent to a concentration camp. So Hitler cared about Germany in as much as he would save it, but beyond that, he never seems to have given it much consideration. While Hitler certainly has some natural talents, genius is a strong word. He did have an excellent memory and obviously a natural talent for public speaking. Of course, the real question is, did he have a talent for military command and organization? And the answer to that seems to be not particularly. Hitler was a gambler who had a terrible habit of going for broke. This paid off early because France and Britain were avoiding conflict, and Russia was an outcast concerned with its own internal stability. Hitler made some correct assumptions early on and had a good sense of what he could get away with. But Hitler wanted war. While he was shocked France and Britain went to war over Poland, he basically goaded them into declaring war since he threatened the Sudetenland. He was infuriated Mussolini orchestrated the Munich Conference and stopped a war from breaking out. Hitler didn't have much to do with the invasion of Poland, since everyone involved considered this an easy win, and he didn't have much to do with the fall of France either. I say this not because he wasn't involved in the process, he was very deeply involved in the process, but a lot of what came up and the details were orchestrated by the generals, and he just kind of said, yeah, that's good, and approved it. The plan developed for the fall of France was made by generals Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian, and they just let Hitler take credit for it. Hitler wanted to invade France the entire winter and spring and had to be talked down from it multiple times. When the invasion went off, generals like Guderian disobeyed his orders and kept moving towards the Channel, which irritated Hitler, but he got over it since the campaign was such a success and he got all the praise. Given that Hitler and Goering oversaw Sea Lion, it was doomed from the start, since neither of them focused on radar stations, and Hitler made the decision to start bombing London instead of the airfields. Russia was a collective failure, since everyone seems to have thought Russia was just going to fall apart, and it didn't. The last meaningful gamble was trying to get the Caucasus. But Hitler decided to dump more resources into Stalingrad even when it was clear the battle was not of great strategic importance. After that, Hitler was determined to get the initiative back, and it just never materialized. Taking all this into account, Hitler is no Napoleon, and most of the victories on the field were not his brainchild even if he greenlit them. Hitler was a gambler, not a strategist. And when you gamble, you win some and you lose some. There have been multiple claims that Hitler had a Jewish grandparent. And while this is a possibility, it is not something we have a definitive answer on. Here are the facts. Hitler's paternal grandmother, Maria, had his father, Alois, out of wedlock to a man we don't know. At the time, she worked as a maid in Austria on the border of Bavaria. Maria returned to her childhood home to have her son, and there she married a man, George Heidler, who refused to state legally that Alois was his son. The marriage failed after a few months, and Maria left her son with George's brother Johann. Eventually, Alois went to a priest to state that George was legally his father. However, this was technically illegal since George had been dead for some time when Alois did this. He also changed the spelling of the last name for unknown reasons. We don't really know anything else beyond this for sure. We have an account from Hans Frank where he states he investigated Hitler's background and found the man Maria worked for was Jewish, but there have been no documents to confirm this. It is possible that Hitler found evidence of his parentage and destroyed it to keep his secret safe, or that he genuinely just didn't know since it was the 1830s and there was no DNA testing to be sure. This is a difficult one. Hitler's sanity has been subject to a lot of scrutiny, and there is a lot of evidence that has been destroyed or lost, which makes the subject very difficult to track. My understanding is that Hitler was never really considered normal by the standards of the time. Many people who met him when he was in Vienna or during his rise to power reported a man with strange behaviors who was not very social and was often pretty awkward. I'm not a psychologist, so take this with a grain of salt, but I wouldn't be surprised if Hitler had something like Asperger's or low-level autism. He was incredibly intelligent, but his social skills seemed to be lacking for most of his life until he found himself in extraordinary situations where he was the most beloved and powerful man in the room. And even then, he did not behave in a way we would consider normal. It should be noted that his decision to go to war was not just some deluded fantasy. Most of the steps leading up to and during the war were very carefully considered and calculated. He very rarely just rushed into a foreign policy decision without agonizing over it for days in advance. He was very aware of what was going on the front lines and kept track of Germany's material strength as well. The issues really started in 1941 when it became clear that Germany wasn't about to win a quick victory in Russia, and he started spending more time in the wolf's lair, away from the public, and started taking weird medications from his questionable physician, Theodor Morell. I would not say his decision to declare war on the US was a bout of insanity as much as a very bad miscalculation, driven by his limited understanding of the US and his crippling go-for-broke mentality. By 1944, he had almost completely descended into a world of fantasy, particularly around the generals, who he was always self-conscious with. Hitler did not do much of anything for his mental or physical health. I mean, sure, he was taking medications, but those were mostly just to bring down symptoms rather than treat the root of the problem. I think this is primarily because he didn't want to get better, because he couldn't admit that he had done anything wrong up to this point, and more importantly, because he knew they were doomed. While there is plenty of room to debate when exactly Hitler realized and accepted the war was lost, to me it seems certain that he was at least considering the idea by 1943, and it finally sank in by 44. The reason 43 was the real turning point to me is because by the end of the year, it was clear that the Germans were not going to regain the initiative in the East, which means they were not going to get the total victory against Russia. Hitler was never going to make a negotiated peace with the communists. That was just never on the table. His goal had been to kill them completely to save the Aryan race. And that plan had clearly come to an end. While he could still hypothetically cut a deal with Russia and dominate Europe, he was never going to get his desired living space in the East, which meant his whole life's work and his entire ideology was no longer viable. But in being the infallible dictator, there was no way he could admit he was wrong. I must imagine this realization gnawed at him endlessly, and that the medication he received was, in part, to distract his mind from this. As the war rolled on, Hitler became more unhinged, because if he was to face the situation in a realistic way, he would have to admit he failed and was wrong. And the longer he put that off, the more they lost, and the harder it became to do that. So, unwilling to let go of his pride, Hitler sent Germany into a death spiral and took the continent with him.